Love horror movies, haunted houses, creepy cult classics? Love a good drink while you scream? Then you need to check out Spooky Sips, the podcast where three spooky-loving ladies dive into horror movies old and new, all while sipping on some delicious spirits of their own. From slashers and slow burns to final girls and found footage, they bring the laughs, the screams, and the cocktails every 2 weeks. So grab your glass, hit play, and join the watch party because horror is better with friends, and maybe a little wine. New episodes every other Thursday. Listen to Spooky Sips wherever you get your podcasts.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Down the Crooked Path is researched and recorded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Attawandaron, and the Mississauga of Credit First. This land has been home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and we recognize their enduring connection. We are grateful to share these stories on their lands that carry their histories, and we encourage our listeners to reflect on the past, present, and future of the land they call home. Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Our story begins in the 1940s. On a frosty autumn morning in central New Brunswick, two brothers are checking trap lines on old motorbikes, and they stop to roll cigarettes. The mist clings to the trees, and the silence of the woods feels heavy. Until something moves. Bounding through the tree line comes a creature they will never forget. At first, they think it's a bear, but then it stands upright, towering, muscular, covered in dark hair, with a head like a wolf and eyes burning with intelligence. It walks towards them, sniffs the air and smells the cigarette smoke, before dropping back onto all fours and vanishing into the forest like a ghost. But this was no bear. It was Canada's Dogman. People have been talking about human-shaped creatures with canine features for a long time. In ancient Greece, there were accounts of men taking on wolf-like bodies after violating sacred rules. In parts of France, court records describe people being accused of turning into violent, dog-shaped attackers. Northern Europeans had groups who believed that they could take on the instincts and physical traits of wolves during battle. Other regions had their own versions with different animals. Some communities in West and Central Africa describe men who could become hyenas. In parts of South America, there are stories about jaguar men. Across Asia, certain areas have accounts of people who could shift into canine or wolf-like forms under specific circumstances. Indigenous nations across North America also have long-standing stories about beings who could move between human and animal identities. Some of those stories involve canine forms, including a tail, upright dog-like features that appear in unusual situations. These accounts weren't identical to the ones the settlers later brought with them, but the idea of a human-canine hybrid figure was already present in North America. When settlers arrived in the land that would become Canada, they brought their own transformation stories, and those mixed into the culture alongside the older accounts already rooted here. Over time, people in the Great Lake region and throughout parts of Canada's wilderness began reporting encounters with large, upright, dog-shaped creatures. People eventually started calling it the Dogman. Dogman sightings have spread across Canada and the United States, including Michigan, Wisconsin, Kentucky, and Ohio. They all have tales of half dog, half human, and part something else type creatures. Despite the story I just told you originating from the 1940s, most Dogman stories are much more recent. In Canada, stories about upright dog-like creatures began circulating in rural Ontario, the prairies, and the Great Lake regions. But for the most part, they were considered to be mistaken local wildlife, and accounts stayed fairly regional until the late 1980s, when a Michigan radio host pulled an April Fool's joke. Stephen Cook was a production director at WTCH in Traverse City. In 1987, he put together a short, campfire-style song for an April Fool's segment. He called it The Legend, and he treated it like a one-off joke built from bits of North American folklore he'd collected over the years. He later said that he had never heard a single Michigan Dogman report before writing the song. The plan was simple: play the song, get a few laughs, and move on. But that's not what happened. After it aired, the station started getting calls from people who said they had seen the creature from the song, and some of the stories went back decades. So once all these calls started coming in, you gotta think that the people in Canada were listening to this and going, okay, but we've been talking about something like this for years. And one of the first cases that really stands out comes from Ontario. In 1965, a truck driver was headed through the rural outskirts of Smithville. At the time, that area was mostly farmland and patches of forest. According to what he told reporters, he saw something standing near the side of the road. He estimated it at around 6 to 7 feet tall. It had long, human-like arms and these massive shoulders that didn't match the rest of the frame. What really stuck with him was the head. He said it looked too small for the body, like it didn't fit the proportions of whatever it was he was looking at. He reported the encounter, and it ended up in the Hamilton Spectator. And you've got to think that someone going to the newspaper with this story in the mid-60s knew that he'd be opening himself up to some ridicule, but he still did it. And once the article ran, the story didn't just sit on the page. People in the area started repeating it, and over time, the starting picked up a nickname. Researchers and storytellers later began referring to it as the Beast of Smithville, and reported sightings still happen to this day. Another report from that same general region came decades later. This one happened in the mid-2010s on a 6-lane stretch of highway leading west to Hamilton. A woman was driving home from work in the afternoon when she saw an animal cross the road ahead of her. She said the area was surrounded by thick brush, small valleys, and water channels that feed into Lake Ontario, so seeing wildlife here wasn't unusual. But what stopped her was the size of what she saw. She estimated that the animal was about half a kilometer in front of her, and even at that distance, she could tell that something was very off. She said the body length from the nose to the back end took up almost the entire width of the traffic lane. At first, she believed it was a dog, but she couldn't make sense of how a dog could get to be that large. According to her, it moved towards the wooded dip in the landscape and then disappeared into a ravine. She later told her boyfriend about it and still brings it up from time to time. She didn't have any other witnesses and she didn't report it at the time, but the size and the location puts it in the same cluster of settings that people talk about in that part of Ontario. And sightings in that part of Ontario didn't just stop with Smithville or the highways around Hamilton. Once you start looking at the region as a whole, you see reports stretching right across the Niagara Peninsula. One of the most talked about ones comes out of Crooks Mills, and it happened years before anyone was even using the word Dogman. This was sometime in the late 1960s, or conflicting reports say the 1970s. A witness was out near the tree line on the edge of the community when they saw what they first thought was a large wolf. But the longer they looked, the less that made any sense. The animal was standing upright, not struggling to lose balance, not wobbling the way an injured animal might. It was standing the way a person would, and it moved like it was completely natural for it to behave that way. The witness later said that they couldn't forget the creature's eyes. They described them as intelligent, almost amused, like it was sizing them up. And I don't know about you, but you gotta think that someone who's seen plenty of wildlife knows the difference between an animal reacting out of fear and something that looks like it's thinking about its next move. According to the witness, there was a moment when they genuinely felt like the creature was considering walking towards them. It didn't, though. After a few seconds, it turned on its hind legs and walked back to the trees with the same steady, controlled movement that it had when the person first saw it. Now, this encounter didn't get reported in the newspapers the same way the Smithville sighting did, but inside Niagara, it's one of those stories that keeps coming up when people talk about strange things in the woods. Once you step outside of Ontario, you start to see that these upright, canine-shaped beings aren't just an Eastern Canadian thing. Communities across the country have their own versions, and some of them go back long before anyone was calling anything Dogman. The Spuzum people were a part of the Inkapama Nation, an interior Salish group whose traditional lands stretch throughout the Fraser Canyon and into the surrounding mountains. Their history goes back thousands of years, long before modern borders or modern cryptid culture existed. One of the older Spuzum stories tells of a time when the canyon was still wild and the trails between communities were dangerous. According to the legend, travelers moving through the Fraser Canyon would sometimes see tall, wolf-like beings standing on the ridges above them. These weren't ordinary animals. They walked upright, watching silently, and never approached unless they chose to. In the stories, the dog people were considered guardians. They kept an eye on the paths, especially at night when rockslides, predators, and hostile visitors were real threats. People said that if you were traveling alone and you suddenly felt like you were being watched, it didn't mean danger. Sometimes it meant that the dog people were making sure that you got to where you were going. But the legend also says that they weren't always protectors. In some versions, seeing one too close was a warning, a sign that you were going somewhere you shouldn't be, or that something in that area needed to be respected. The dog people didn't speak, but their presence was treated like a message, and you needed to pay attention to it. When you move into the subarctic, into that stretch of land between the Great Slave Lake and the Great Bear Lake, the stories deepen again. This is the homeland of the Telitchko people, sometimes called the Dog Rib, one of the Dene nations whose history is tied to the boreal forest, the muskeg, and the long winter trails that connect the Northwest Territories. Their stories go back thousands of years, and among them is one of the most striking origin legends, involving a being that today would sound a lot like a dogman. But inside the culture, it's not a cryptid. It's a part of how the people understood themselves and the land. The version most people know was recorded in the 1940s by a Hudson Bay Company inspector who spent years traveling through the region. He wrote about the Telitchko tradition that explained where their people came from. According to the story, long before there were settlements or mining towns, a young woman from the northern community married a mysterious stranger who had arrived at her family's lodge. He was strong, handsome, and seemed to appear out of nowhere, something that, in these stories, is usually a sign that a person isn't exactly what they seem to be.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Nikinagana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Nikinagana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit payyourrent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
On their first nights together, the woman noticed something strange. Her new husband would disappear after she fell asleep, and she would wake to the sound of bones being crunched near the fire. When she and her brothers tried to catch whatever was making the noise, they never saw anything. But on the third night, one of the brothers threw a stone axe towards the sound. What they found wasn't a man. It was a black dog wounded and dying on the floor of the lodge. When the husband didn't return, the brothers became convinced that the sister had unknowingly married a being that could move between human and animal form, a dogman, a sorcerer, something outside of the ordinary world. Terrified, they forced her to leave, and this is where the story shifts from eerie to mythic. Alone in the barren lands, the woman gave birth, not to human infants, but to puppies. She kept them hidden in a caribou skin bag, protecting them from the cold and from anyone who might see them. As they grew, she noticed something impossible. When the puppies stepped into sunlight, they didn't stay puppies. They transformed into human children. And when they jumped back into the shadows of the bag, they became animals again. One morning, she returned from checking her snares and found tiny human footprints in the ashes around her fire. It was that moment that she understood what was happening. The next day, she hid and watched. As soon as the puppies crawled out of the bag and into the light, they became children, laughing, playing, completely human. She acted quickly, pulling the bag closed before all of them could leap back inside. In the end, she kept 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls, in the daylight long enough for them to remain human permanently. Those 4 children, according to the legend, became the ancestors of the Dog-Rib people. And inside the culture, the story isn't treated as a monster tale. It's an origin story. It explains why dogs are treated with respect, why harming them is taboo, and why the boundary between human and animal wasn't always seen as fixed. It's a reminder that beings can exist in more than one form, and that the world is full of relationships that settlers later tried to categorize but never fully understood. Along the Great Lakes, early French-Canadian settlers had their own stories about upright, wolf-headed beings. By the late 1700s, they already had their own versions, the loup-garou, a werewolf-like figure that was said to hunt the shorelines of Lake St. Clair. One of the most famous stories comes from the Detroit River region in the 1770s. It centers around a young farmer named Pierre Lafontaine and his fiancée Archange Soumette, whose family lived along the waters of Grosse Pointe. According to the legend, Pierre had just dropped Archange off at her father's cabin one evening when she heard something moving in the brush behind her. When she turned, she saw a figure step across her path, tall, upright, and unmistakably wolf-headed with a long, sweeping tail behind it. Her scream brought her father running, but by the time he reached her, the creature had already slipped back into the trees. But the description was enough for him. He recognized it immediately as a loup-garou, a being the old voyagers warned about. The story only escalates from here. On the morning of her wedding, Archange went into the woods to gather flowers and came face to face with the creature again. This time, it was wearing a coat and hat, clothing that it had apparently stolen, and carried itself with an eerie, almost mocking confidence. She barely made it back to the cabin before it reached her. But the most dramatic moment came later that day, right around the middle of the wedding celebration. As guests were dancing outside the cabin, the loup-garou burst out of the woods, grabbed Archange, and vanished with her into the forest. Pierre and the other men chased after them, following her cries as far as they could. But one by one, the searchers returned empty-handed. Pierre didn't come back until nightfall. When neighbors finally found him, he was wandering through a swamp in shock, clutching a torn piece of Archange's wedding dress. He couldn't explain what had happened. He couldn't even speak. All he could do was stare into the water as if something were calling to him from beneath the surface. The legend says that he never recovered. For months afterward, he returned to the same swamp, standing at the edge for hours, staring into the still water as though waiting for something to return. And then, almost a year later, the story took its final turn. During another family wedding, Pierre suddenly runs into the woods, as if pulled from some unseen force. Moments later, the loup-garou appeared again, sprinting towards Lake St. Clair with Pierre chasing it. When the creature reached the shoreline, it climbed onto a boulder, raised its arms as if signaling to something in the water. A massive catfish appeared and opened its mouth, and the loup-garou stepped inside and disappeared beneath the lake. According to the old storytellers, that's why some families around Lake St. Clair refused to eat catfish for generations. And they claimed that the footprint of the creature, that last mark it left on land, remained pressed into one of the shoreline boulders. When you look at these stories side by side, the sightings in Ontario, the teachings from the Spuzum First Nation, the Talichko origin story, you start to notice the same features showing up in places that have nothing to do with each other on the surface. One detail that comes up again and again is the way that these beings move. People describe them as walking on two legs with a certain steadiness, confident and upright, more man than animal. Then there's the head. Almost every account, whether it's a modern sighting or a story passed down for generations, describes something unmistakably wolf-like. A long muzzle, upright ears, a shape that reads canine even when the rest of the body doesn't. And the body, the upper body, is often described as unusually human with broad shoulders, long arms, and a build that doesn't match a wolf or dog's description. Across Canada, these beings are described as watching more than fleeing, observing, assessing, sometimes curious, sometimes cautious, sometimes giving the impression that they're the ones deciding how the encounter ends. And whether people interpret these as spiritual beings, folklore, or unexplained creatures, the consistency is hard to ignore. Whatever this figure represents, it's been a part of Canada's landscape for a very long time. Over the past several decades, more recently, people across Canada have reported brief encounters, Drivers talk about tall figures stepping into rural roads at dusk and moving across the pavement with steady, upright strides before disappearing into the trees. Hikers and hunters in several provinces describe seeing a shape standing between the trunks or moving parallel to them at a measured distance. Ranchers mention a silhouette near fence lines that stay upright for a moment before turning and walking back in towards the trees. People have tried to explain the Dogman in every way they can. Some lean towards animals that have not been identified. Others connect that to older beliefs that were here long before written records. And then there are the people who don't commit to any explanation at all. Whether Dogman is a creature, a spirit, or a story we tell ourselves to explain the dark edges of a map, one thing is certain. It has been walking beside us for a very long time.